7 more weeks of class before finals week. That's including Thanksgiving week. So that blows my mind. We're in the thick of the semester, and if you're like me, that might remind you of how much still needs to happen before the end of the semester. And if you're like me, that might give you a little hint of panic when you think about everything that still has to be done. And when you, if you're like me, when you start to feel overwhelmed, you shift into accomplish mode. That's what I do. I shift into accomplish mode. Everything becomes about doing. Even playtime becomes about doing. Last Monday was Braden's 15th birthday, and by the grace of God, he didn't have any homework that was due Tuesday. So we're like, great, we've got all afternoon and evening with Braden. So we asked Braden, okay, Braden, it's your birthday. How do you want to spend your birthday? What do you want to do with us? Where do you want to eat? Let's make a plan and get to it. And Braden wasn't sure what he wanted to do. And we're like, okay, Braden, whatever you choose. We'll be excited about it. We'll do whatever you want to do. Braden wasn't sure what he wanted to do. All right, Braden, but it's your birthday, so just pick something and let's do it. And Braden wasn't sure what he wanted to do, and we started to get annoyed with Braden on his birthday. And then we finally realized that Braden didn't care about doing anything. He just wanted to be with us. And that's the best part of being in a family, right? Being together. And the main thing we ended up doing that night was asking questions and having conversation together, which was what Braden wanted. But I was in accomplish mode, so I didn't see it right away, unfortunately. I was so focused on doing something that I lost sight of being together. I was so focused on doing something that I lost sight of being together. I think the same's true in other parts of my life. When I feel burdened or when I feel overwhelmed, I shift into accomplish mode. Let me cross off as many things as possible from my list, and then when I crash from exhaustion, I just want to sleep or play, and then I'll finally get back into my list again. And when I'm in accomplish mode, the first thing that tends to get set aside is my spiritual life. My relationship with God and my relationship with community are the first things I'm tempted to set aside when my plate is too full. My relationship with God and my spiritual community are the first things I'm tempted to set aside when my plate is too full. Can you guys relate? Many of you went on the Father's Retreat last weekend. It was an awesome weekend in every way. But this past week, maybe you just wanted to hibernate. Maybe you wanted to drop everything but homework and existing, or maybe throw in playing too, because of anxiety. Even if you didn't go to the retreat, we're still in the thick of the semester. Maybe this past week wasn't your crazy week. Maybe it was the week before that. Maybe it's this coming week or the week after that. But even if now wasn't when you feel the squeeze of your schedule, everybody knows what I'm talking about, of feeling that squeeze in our schedule. And whenever you feel that squeeze, what's the first thing you're tempted to drop out of that schedule? Is it Netflix, or euchre, or random XYZ activity? Or when we're squeezed, are you tempted to drop your quiet time? Drop going to worship, to skip your life group, your small group Bible study. Maybe you really wrestled with whether or not you would come here this morning. Busyness can make the things of God that are designed for our health and balance, strength, start to look like a chore rather than a blessing. And maybe we're tempted to think, is it worth it? Some people in the Bible asked that question. In my Bible reading plan, I was in the book of Malachi last week. That's the book right before Matthew chapter 1. And I'm going to look at a verse from that. Malachi chapter 3, verse 14. It's like a page or two right before Matthew chapter 1. Malachi 3:14. God says this. You have said it is vain to serve God. What is the profit of keeping his charge or walking as in mourning before the Lord of hosts? So they're asking the question, what's the profit of following God? When I'm tempted not to. I could do so much more. I could accomplish so much more. I could play so much. We're going to look at how God addressed that a little later on in the message. But we're tempted to ask the same questions, aren't we? Is it worth it to keep investing in my spiritual life when I've got so much else to do? Is it worth it to keep working towards the goals that I was sure God was directing me towards in August and September? Is it worth it to keep looking for God at work around me? Is it worth it to stay connected to God and his people when I'm overwhelmed? That's really the question of the morning. Is it worth it to stay connected to God and his people when I'm overwhelmed? And that's a great question. Fortunately for us, when we feel that squeeze, we can gain a better perspective from God's word on that. Jesus actually told a parable about this very situation. And it's one of his more famous parables, but I never noticed how it directly applied to this until I was looking at it this week. It's the parable of the sower, or the parable of the four soils. And we're going to look at it in Mark 4. It's kind of a long parable, so I'm going to summarize most of it, but then we'll look in at the end. So if you want to turn to Mark 4 for just a little bit, you're welcome to do that. So Jesus tells this story. It says a farmer started scattering some seed. Some fell on a path and it became birdseed. And some fell on rocky ground, some fell on thorny ground. And in both those soils, the seed sprouted, there was a little bit of life, but it never produced any fruit. And lastly, some seed fell on good, cultivated soil, and it produced a big crop. The end. Isn't that a nice story? And that's the way he left it for the crowd. And like a little later, the disciples, Jesus, what are you talking about with that parable? So he explained it to him. He said the seed represented the Word of God, in particular the gospel, but could be the Word of God in general. And the soils represent the condition of people's hearts, or the way they're living their lives. And will they harden their heart to God's message, like the path? Will they accept it with joy but never develop any root, like the rocky ground that prevents roots from going down deeper? Then it gets to the ground full of thorns. So we're going to read what Jesus explained about that one and continue on to the good soil. So Mark 4, verses 18 through 20. Mark 4, verses 18 through 20 said, "And others are the ones that sown among thorns. They are those who hear the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches and the desires for other things enter in and choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. Those that were sown on the good soil are the ones who hear the word, accept it, and bear fruit, 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold. So I used to have a very narrow picture of what the thorny ground was until I did a word study on it this week. And I used to think, okay, the cares of the world, the deceitfulness, wealth, desires for other things, that's specifically talking about people caught up in wealth and entertainment, people who are consumed with consumerism. Even though some of the translations say the worries of the world, I still always pictured it as primarily talking about wealth and entertainment, the unbalanced pursuit of pleasure. Then I took a deeper look at some of the words this week, and the word for cares or worries in that passage, the cares of the world, in the Greek, it's the word merimnai, which means, it does mean cares or concerns, but it also means anxieties. Carries the idea of distraction or disuniting our thoughts. So, and when it says those thorns end up choking the word, The word for that means to strangle or literally to drown, so you're not getting air. So with the thorny soil, Jesus is saying when we feel anxiety in life, pressure, stress, busyness, as well as consumerism, those things distract us and suffocate God's message from bearing fruit in our lives. In other words, busyness drowns my spiritual life. Busyness drowns my spiritual life. Anxiety, busyness, pressure, stress, or being consumed with self-pleasure, any and all that describes the thorny ground. That describes me. This experience of ours, Jesus is basically saying it's a common temptation. When we're facing it, we feel isolated and alone in the problem, but that's the result of choking off our spiritual connections. Of course we feel isolated in it. Because when we give into that, we've disconnected ourselves from the community that God put in our lives, our community with Him and community with His people. So if you struggle with that temptation to cut out the spiritual things first, a couple things we should know at the beginning. If you struggle with that temptation to cut out the spiritual things first, you're not alone. You're not broken. You're not weird because you're tempted in this way. Jesus is saying it's pretty normal. And the devil sticks to what works as far as temptation. The second thing is there's some cultivating to do. There's some cultivating to do. You know, you're not weird, but neither are you fated to stay as the thorny soil. Yes, it was sad that the people in Jesus' parable, many of them never bore fruit in their lives, but that's not where the story ended. He didn't tell us the story so those of us in the thorny soil or those of us in the rocky soil would just sulk and have pity on ourselves because that's where we're at. He ended with the good soil to motivate us so we'd find hope in becoming that good soil. So the question is, how do we go about doing that? There's a lot of wisdom the Bible gives about that. A lot of different directions we could take to get into specific motives and situations. We could talk about spiritual warfare. We could talk about time management. A lot of different things, directions we could go with that. But for this message, I felt God was directing me towards just a bottom line. Like, what's the main thing that I can think about next time I'm tempted with this? What's something that will change? Here's the answer. I need to remember. Remember that my spiritual connections are my lifeline. I need to remember that my spiritual connections are my lifeline. If I can latch onto this idea, my decisions are going to conform to that. The details are kind of going to work themselves out. Remember that my spiritual connections are my lifeline. Really, a lifeline, is that being a little dramatic? Well, it shouldn't be dramatic to say that. That's the whole question of, is it worth it? The answer is yes, and that's why we need to remember. Let's look at John 15. Jesus told another illustration here. John 15, we're going to look at verses 5 and 6, and then skip to verse 10 and verse 12. Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers. The branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. Verse 10, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. Verse 12, and this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. So this passage ties in our direct connection to God, abiding in him. It ties into our indirect connection with God by connecting with his people. His command to love people is how we abide in God. It ties into the farming illustration again that we've talked about a lot this fall. It ties in the idea of a lifeline, a source of life. When we find our nourishment and our source of life from staying connected. So I've got a picture of a lifeline. This is my nephew, Mason, the son of Heather's brother, who was our retreat speaker last weekend, Ken Nash. And it's a little joke going on in the family that he's praising the Lord there with his arms raised up. When Mason was born, he didn't latch on well for nursing, and he started to lose some weight. He was born at 7 pounds. He lost 1.5 pounds, which is like 21% of his body weight before he was brought into the hospital and got this feeding tube. And at times they needed to supplement that with oxygen, and just recently he's been on oxygen as well as his feeding tube. The good news is he's up to about 8 pounds now. You can see a little bit of plumpness in the picture there. But for now, the little orange tube is Mason's lifeline. Without that, he will begin to wither, like the branch Jesus said that's cut off from the vine and thrown away, without the source of life flowing to it. Our connection with God and our Christian community is our lifeline. Whether I'm more tempted to skip my quiet time, or more tempted to skip meeting with my Christian family, I still need to remember that my spiritual connections are my lifeline. When we succumb to that temptation to put off our quiet time, to put off gathering for worship or life group, it's like we're stepping on our own lifeline. If you're hooked up to oxygen or whatever, IV, and you go and step on your line, it's not going to be very beneficial. When a member of the community comes in to help us out, hey, you're stepping on your line there, we can even get a little testy and push away from them, just like someone who's drowning will panic, or someone who's hungry will get cranky. Because we're cutting off our own lifeline, we react in ways that we wouldn't normally react. And once we pinch it off, we can start to self-destruct pretty quickly. If I skip life group or church this week, I'm a lot more likely to skip it again next week. If I miss my quiet time today, I'm much more likely to miss it again tomorrow. We end up hurting ourselves. When we pinch off our lifeline out of anxiety, we're cutting off our sources for healing, sources for handling anxiety with grace and peace. I'll say that again. When we pinch off our lifeline out of anxiety, we're cutting off our sources for handling anxiety with grace and peace. We should remind ourselves of this verse. It's a favorite verse of many people, Isaiah 40, verse 31. It says, "But they who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not be faint." I found out the word for wait in that passage, and those wait on the Lord, that's a figurative meaning of the Hebrew word. It literally means to bind or twist together. So, again, it's that idea of abiding with Christ and being kind of wound up together with Him, relying on Him for our strength in the day-to-day. It's not in waiting in busyness. It's waiting and being together. So before we get too far down that slippery slope of that temptation, I'll just skip this time. We need to remember that my spiritual connections are my lifeline. When I remember God, when we remember God, He will remember us too, which is kind of a neat thought. come back to the passage in Malachi that I talked about earlier. Malachi 3. I'm going to read verses 13 through 18. So I'm backing it up a verse. God says, "Your words have been hard against me," says the Lord. "But you say, how have we spoken against you? You have said, it is vain to serve God. What is the profit of our keeping his charge or walking as in mourning before the Lord of hosts? And now we call the arrogant blessed. Evildoers not only prosper, but they put God to the test and they escape." So the people are basically saying, is it worth it? Saying that it looks like others are succeeding in life without putting any time into God. Let's see how it continues. Verse 16 says, "Then those who feared the Lord spoke with one another." They had community with each other. And when they did that, the Lord paid attention and heard them, and a book of remembrance was written before him. So those who feared the Lord and esteemed his name. When we remember God, he remembers us. Especially when we remember him together in that community. And this is always going to be for our benefit. If God remembers you, if God doesn't forget anything, like it's not like, oh yeah, I forgot about you. He always remembers it. It just means we're brought to the forefront of his attention. And it's always going to be a blessing for us, both in the day-to-day and in eternal, for our eternal reward. Those that seem to do all right without God, it's just that it seems that way. It's just a mask, most likely, or just a short period of time that's going to change. And you know that. I know that from experience. If you've been on that slippery slope of thinking, skipping time with God, skipping time with his people, the temptation is that there's going to be relief in my schedule. I'll put this aside. Oh, there's relief in my schedule. But that's what makes the temptation attractive, is that idea of relief there. But when we do that, on the other side of it, we discover emptiness. We discover feeling bad about it. We discover we're cranky about things more so than we would have been. And we realize that things got worse rather than better when I set aside my spiritual connections. Because we're finishing our own lifeline. What if those things don't feel like my lifeline? Quiet time, spending time with other believers, doesn't feel like a lifeline to me. That's a valid question. But just like I said about feeling isolated in the temptation, if we're not giving them the proper chance, of course we're going to feel like that. It's not about legalism and never being able to go home for the weekend or allow for things that come up in life. It's not about legalism. It's about giving your relationship with God and his people the opportunity to be your lifeline. So it's not about legalism and saying you can never skip or anything. It's about giving your relationship with God and his people the opportunity to be your lifeline. Because if there's other factors for them to be your lifeline, am I being real, or am I wearing masks? Am I treating it like a relationship, or am I treating it like a checklist? There's other things that are going to affect it. But without consistency, without any commitment to it, those relationships are going to have a really hard time doing what they're designed to do in our lives if we don't give them the chance by showing up and being with God, being with people. So, you could use a lifeline, couldn't you? I know I could use a source of light in my busy schedule. That's why we need to remember in the face of those temptations. So those times when I feel the squeeze of busyness in my life, when I remember this, I'm going to adjust to my lifeline rather than to the temptation. So when I feel the squeeze, when I remember this, that my spiritual connections are my lifeline, I'm going to adjust to my lifeline instead of adjusting to the temptation. That's why I said the details will kind of work themselves out when we have the priority clear in our mind. Is it worth it? It's worth it to stay connected to God, stay connected to His people. It always is.